you'd asked me what my dream was when I was a teenager, I would have told you about the life I'm living right now. The touring, parties, the girls.
I sometimes try to have a conversation with my daughter, but it just feels like everyone is in their own world.
It's not that I think I'm better than the other players, but I know I work harder. I still cannot believe the coach cut me for a bad attitude.
11 years I've been working here now. Lately, I've been working so hard, just trying to get my next promotion.
He was out of a movie, this guy. The romantic dates, the flowers. He was funny, kind. My family all loved him. It seemed too perfect. I broke up with him after a year. He was devastated. Sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake, but if it's too good to be true, it must be, right? I've been dating again, but nothing serious. I learned since my first husband cheated and left me that I'm the only one I can trust.
Well, I want to welcome you to the first of a 5-part series that we're calling Didn't See It Coming. So whether you're joining us in one of our rooms today at our locations, or whether you're watching live online or listening or watching on demand, really, really glad that you're here. And we're going to talk about some of the things that honestly in leadership surprise us, things we didn't see coming. And if you're with us physically in attendance today, you get a gift after the service. You get a free book. So it's a book that I wrote. It just came out this week. And we are giving one copy of the book to every family. So if you're in the attendance today, make sure you pick that up on the way out. This is a book that I've been working on for a while. I wrote it last summer. And it's really not a biography by any stretch, or an autobiography, but just like it's a very personal book. It's about some of the challenges in life and leadership that honestly I didn't see coming. One of them, truthfully, was the didn't see it coming jokes that I've gotten over the last week every single day. Like I blew a flat on my bike. People are like, bet you didn't see that coming. Like, oh my gosh. Like, please, spare me in the lobby, okay? After, no, I didn't see it coming. And ironically, I didn't see that coming when I named the book this. But anyway, so in the book, we cover 7 challenges that no one expects and everyone experiences. In the series, we're down to 5. So I guess, they got downvoted off the island, 2 of them. So we're not talking about moral compromise. Just don't, okay? Don't moral compromise. That's a whole week on moral compromise. Don't. All right, you can skip that chapter. And then also there's one on irrelevance. So go ahead and become irrelevant. Apparently it's not important enough to include in this series. But we are going to be tackling 5 of the challenges that everyone expects and no one experiences. And just to get the weirdness out of the room, there's always this thing, if you follow church world or whatever, there's a conflict of interest when it comes to, well, how did everybody get a free copy? Did you make the church buy your book so it can hit the bestseller list? So Tony and I just decided, my wife and I decided that we were going to pay for these books personally. So you would think that like an author gets them for free, right? Wouldn't you? Oh, well, you didn't need to do that. So that's why it's one per family, because we're cheap. But anyway... no, you would think like Elon Musk gets free Teslas for life or whatever, because he runs Tesla, but apparently you have to buy your books as an author. So anyway, we wanted to do that for you, and that way it gets the conflict of interest out of the way as well. So thank you for being here. Some of you, you know where we're going to kick off? We're going to kick off talking about cynicism. And for some of you, you're cynical about even being in church. You heard there was a free book. That's why you came. But like, you don't like church. You're not sure about it. Some of you have grown cynical about relationships. You're like, I really don't like men anymore. I really don't like women anymore. Some of you are cynical about work. Some of you are cynical about life. But here's the interesting thing about cynicism. Nobody sets out to become cynical. Like nobody decides, right? At age 18, it's like, hey, by the time I'm 35, I'm going to be cynical, jaded, bitter, and angry. That's my life goal. But it happens all the time. We end up to the point, and we didn't see it coming. We just don't know, like, how did I actually get to the point where I became that cynical? How did I get to the point where I just don't trust anybody anymore? How did I get to the point where I don't hope anymore? And that's what I want to talk to you about today. Now, I believe God has an awful lot to say about that. I think he wants to breathe some hope and some life into you. But I want to back up and tell you a little bit more about my life and my story. I never thought that I would be a pastor. Now, I grew up in a Christian family. My parents were here at the first service this morning. Actually, my dad's running one of the cameras. So I was taught from the time I was a little kid that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. I actually believe that. But I never thought I'd be a pastor. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you have to be a pastor. So from the time I was 8 years old, I had decided I wanted to be a lawyer. Now, I don't know what needs to be wrong with you at the age of 8 to want to be a lawyer, but all that was wrong with me. But anyway, I pursued that my whole time, got into the law school of my dreams in Toronto, couldn't believe it. Best thing to ever come out of law school was my wife. We met in first year law, but it was in between first and second year law that I felt a call to ministry. And that was a real shock for me. So I thought, well, what do I do with law? So I finished law school. I worked for a year in law in downtown Toronto because I thought, okay, what is one of the criticisms people always levy at pastors? And I've heard this before I was in ministry, now that I've been in ministry. It's like, you guys have never worked a day in your life. And that's kind of interesting. You ever think about that? Like, what does a pastor do? You only see me show up 1 hour a week, and I have to work doubly hard because we have 2 services. So, I mean, it's exhausting, 2 whole hours on a Sunday. But, like, what does a pastor actually do? So I thought, you know what, I'm going to earn a paycheck in law in almost the opposite, and I have lots of lawyer friends. Trust me, we're hanging out with them later today. But what seems like the opposite of ministry. So I worked in downtown Toronto for a year. And it didn't take me very long to figure out that there were a lot of unhappy lawyers in the city of Toronto. In fact, very quickly, I started going around to all my law school graduate friends, and I said, hey, if you can find me a happy lawyer in the city of Toronto, I'll pay you $1 million, because, I can't find one. And we worked at a smaller firm, but we were up against all the big firms. I was in court almost every day, and I just couldn't believe how cynical so many of the lawyers had gotten so quickly. There was one lawyer, he was in his 30s, and I remember, I'm a low guy on the totem pole. I'm just a student. I'm sitting there behind my desk working on a case, and this lawyer comes in. He's in his late 30s, and he waves a lottery ticket in my face. And he says, Carey, if I win this thing, you will never see my face again. Now, the challenge was he owned the firm, which is, really interesting. You imagine me or Jeff Brody walking in here on a Sunday morning going, you know what, guys, got a lottery ticket in my hand. If I win this thing, somebody else is preaching part 2 because you will never see my face again. Like, that's a weird place to be, but he had everything. He had the house, he had the car. I knew how much money they made. I don't know why we knew that as students, but we knew it. It was a ridiculous amount of money back in the 90s. It's a ridiculous amount of money today, and yet he bought lottery tickets to get out. And the surprise to me was it wasn't law that made me cynical. Like, I'm an optimist. I'm sort of a born optimist. I always see the glass half full. I believe anything's possible. But fast forward a few years, and it was actually in ministry that I first started to experience cynicism. So the book's a fairly personal book. I tell a lot of our stories. Some of you, and this has been a joy just talking to some of you over this week, you remember the old days. I've been in this area for 23 years. Came up. Connexus has been 11 of those years, but prior to that, some of us were together in a previous version of ministry, and we had a great time together. I started here 23 years ago with 3 little tiny churches, and just a handful of you remember those days because they were small. I would do the circuit on a Sunday morning in these little country churches. One of the churches had an average attendance of 6. Another had an average attendance of 14, and the third church was the mega church. It had 23 people. So that was it. And I mean, they hadn't grown in decades. And as soon as we got up here, by the grace of God, the churches started to grow. And we started to see new people come in, and the churches hadn't grown in decades. And I remember, when you have 6 people, you're thankful when anybody walks through the door. And there was one family in particular that came through the door early in our time in ministry. And I kind of knew almost immediately, I thought, wow, these people have not had it easy in life. You could tell that they weren't rich. You could tell that they had struggled. And I thought, well, this is fantastic. Like, we get a chance to be the church. Like, we can be the church. So the church had no money. I mean, when you have 6 people, you have no money as a church. I was still in school. We had no money. But we put our money together, and we'd buy this family, we'd buy them food gift cards from time to time for the grocery store, or we'd buy them a tank of gas. I remember there was one really cold winter where they didn't have the money to pay their heat bill, so we paid it, even though we didn't have any money. And I thought, well, this is great. Like, we get to be the church. Isn't this what the church is supposed to be? So the churches started to grow, and I would go and visit these people at their home and try to help them through some of their life situations. Soon it wasn't dozens of people, then it was 100, then it was 200, then it was 300. And about 4 or 5 years after we got here, there was one day in particular where at one of the churches we were having a lunch after, and this family was there. And the older gentleman, I'll call him Roger, grabbed his niece and his wife by the hand, and they stormed out of the luncheon, and they shouted, "We're leaving this church. You guys don't care about us anymore." And I was devastated. And I kind of followed him out into the parking lot, and I said, "Hey, wait, what's going on?" And I walked out to the car with him, and he said, "Listen, when the church was small, you used to care. You don't care." And I said, no, I do care. And I tried to defend myself, which is a dumb thing to do, but I mean this sincerely. I said to him, "You know what, to be fair, I don't think I have invested more time with anybody personally over these last 4 or 5 years than I have with you and with your family." And I said, "I don't think we personally invested more financially with anybody. What do you mean I don't care?" And he said, "You don't care. It's not the same." He got in his car, slammed the door, and sped off. And there's no happy ending. Never came back. You know what? Something happened in my heart that day. It grew smaller. It hurt. And for the first time, I felt myself growing cynical. And I don't know whether you've got a story like that. For some of you, it might be relationships. It could be like, "Listen, I've been in love once or twice, 3 times, 4 times. I know what all men are like. I know what women are like. I know this is like," and now you're cynical. You're cynical about the whole thing. Some of you threw your heart into your job. And you really cared. And you thought, "You know what? I'm going to work hard. I'm going to care." And you got fired. Or maybe you didn't get fired, but the guy who was trying half as hard as you, he got the promotion and he got the raise and you didn't. And you're like, "What's with that?" Or you try to make things better with your family. You're trying to make your parents happy. You're trying to make peace in your family, but nobody seems to be responding. And you found you've grown cynical. You've grown cynical about relationships. You've grown cynical about life. You've grown cynical. And when you grow cynical, hope dies. You know what? If you really dive into cynicism, here's what's true. Most cynics are former optimists. If you would say, "Yeah, I'm a little bit cynical now," you know what? If you go back to your earlier self, when you were in high school, when you were in elementary school, when you were in college, when you were out in the workplace, or you're dating or getting engaged or just married, you were optimistic. But now you've been married a long time and you're not as optimistic as you used to be. You're more cynical, you're more jaded. And cynicism, paradoxically, it starts not because you don't care, it starts because you do. There is a time where you're like, "You know what? When I start this business, it's going to be up and to the right. When I become the manager, nobody's ever going to quit. When I do this, it's going to be amazing." And you really threw your heart into it like I did with that family, and somebody snaps it. So the question I want to ask is, why so cynical? Why do we live in a cynical age? Why are so many of us, Christians, non-Christians, whatever your background is, why are we so cynical? It's interesting. The scripture gives us a lot of insight, not only into God, but into life. And one of the things we'll learn, and we'll dive into scripture every week in this series, but cynicism roots itself in knowledge. And the problem with cynics is you end up knowing too much. Like, you ever wonder, why were you so happy when you were a kid? Answer, because you were stupid. That's why. You were dumb. You were dumb. It's like you didn't know anything. You didn't know people could break your heart. You didn't know you could get fired. You didn't know that you would work really, really hard and not get rewarded. You didn't know things were so messed up. You were dumb. And you're like, "Oh, I'm so happy." And now all of a sudden you're in life and things are not going so well and they're not going your way. You know too much. That's why we grow cynical. And there was a guy named Solomon. We'll come back to him later in the series. And he was writing this collected wisdom. He was known in his day as the wisest man in the world. We have a collection of his wise writings, his wisdom sayings, in what we call Ecclesiastes. And we're going to read some verses from the first chapter of Ecclesiastes. This is in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the part of the Bible before Jesus. And this is what he has to say as he reflects on life. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher, completely meaningless. I mean, how encouraging, right? Like, really, okay, thank you for that. What do you ever think about this? You ever thought this thought? What do people get for all their hard work under the sun? What is the company actually going to do for me? Like, do you know how hard I'm working? You know, I try to do everything right. What am I going to get out of this, right? What am I actually going to get for all this hard work under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth never changes. The sun rises, the sun sets, and then hurries around to rise again. The more things change, the more they stay the same. The wind blows south and then turns north. Around and around it goes, blowing in circles. Rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. We'll come back to that text later in the series. Fascinating insight. Then that's how our lives feel. The water returns again and again to the rivers and flows out again to the sea. Everything is wearisome beyond description. No matter how much we see, this is so true, we are never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we are not content. I think Ecclesiastes is like a cynic's guide to the universe. It's fascinating insight. And Solomon says, look, I said to myself, look, I am wiser than any of the kings who ruled in Jerusalem before me. I have greater wisdom and knowledge than any of them. So I set out to learn everything from wisdom and madness and folly. But I learned firsthand that pursuing all this is like chasing the wind. Then he drops this bomb. The greater my wisdom, the greater my grief. The more I knew, the more I know, the sadder I get. To increase knowledge, to know more, only increases sorrow. Where does cynicism come from? You know too much. You know about relationships. You know what people are really like. You know how it goes at work. You know how it goes in family. No family's perfect. You know how it goes with your kids sometimes. You know how it goes with your parents. You know how it goes in neighborhoods. And you know too much. And so, what do you do? What do you do with that? What do I do with that? You just become dumb? So I'll try to unlearn what I've learned? That doesn't work. You know what happened to me? I started doing this when I was in my 30s, 7-8 years into ministry. I started projecting past failures onto future situations. So when Roger and his family left, and my heart died in that moment, you try to recover. But our church has been a growing church over the years, and, we have people leave, but fortunately more people come than leave, and sometimes people come back, so that happens. But I remember the next time somebody walked through the door who reminded me of Roger, maybe not as well off financially as some. And I remember when that happened, I saw somebody at the back door, and I thought, oh, wait a minute. I know how this ends. I know how this ends. You start projecting past failures onto future situations. Some of you, it's relational. It's like you've tried 15 relationships. And now somebody walks in the room, you're like, well, they're kind of good looking, but I think I know how this ends. Some of you with work, it's like, it doesn't matter what industry, it doesn't matter what job. I know where this goes. I know where I'm going to end up. I know how this is going to turn out. And you become cynical. And the hurt of your past pronounces a death sentence on your future. And that's where cynicism starts. It wasn't just one incident. Sometimes there's 4 or 5 or 10 or 20. And there was another thing that happened, and shortly after that I experienced 12 years ago a deep, deep burnout. And we will talk about that in a separate week. And some of you are burning out. Some of you have friends who have burnt out or are burning out. I'll talk about my season of burnout and how to bounce back. But I'll tell you, my goodness, there was a time where, it's hard to build good, meaningful friendships. And you come to a church and you're getting to know people. And we eventually got into a rhythm where there were a few friends that we just really clicked with. And there were the kind of friendships where you have dinner at each other's houses, your kids play together, we went on vacation together, weekends away, stuff like that. It was great. And then in a period of months, apparently out of the blue, some of those friendships dissolved. And I'm one of those people, I mean, that hurts when you've got really close friends and they're close and it doesn't work out. But I'm somebody, if you've followed our teaching at all around here, I'm like, come on, grow up. Own your slice of the pie. What part of this is you? And so I went to some friends who knew the whole situation, knew the people involved, and I said, okay, I know they're upset with me, but what part of this do I own? And you know what my friends, who are very wise, said to me at that time? Actually, Carey, in this case, I don't think you own any of it. I don't think it's you. I think it's them. Which actually makes it even more hurtful, doesn't it? It's like I did everything I could. I don't know how to fix this, and it made it worse. And I felt my heart die even more. I went through a period, my wife Tony's here, and I said to Tony, you know what? I'm done with friends. Classic guy response, right? I don't need people. It's okay, I'm a pastor, but I don't need people, right? I'm not going to have any friends anymore. I'm not going to invest in people. I'm not going to invest in any relationships. And I played that game for about a year where I'm just withdrawing. I'm finished. I'm done with people because it hurt too much. Then I realized after about a year, well, that's stupid. It's not a very good strategy for life. And I also realized this. When you close your heart to people, and some of you have closed your heart to people, you close your heart to God. I know some of you are not even sure there is a God. We're really glad you're here and part of this dialogue. But for those of you who think there's a God and he revealed himself in Jesus, I don't think you can just say, like I tried to do, I'm just going to turn the people valve off, but I'm okay with God. If you're not okay with people, you're not okay with God. And there's something about the human heart where God looks in and says, oh, Carey, it's all crusted and it's not impossible for God to get in, but he respects boundaries. And it's like God says, so you're going to open your heart up again? And what happens when you grow cynical? What happens when you become a cynic? And this is what happened to me before I burned out. This was 15 years ago. You stop trusting, you stop hoping, and you stop believing. And that's some of your story. It's I used to hope. I used to trust. I used to believe. And I'm not even, some of you are still Christians. It's I still believe Jesus is who he says he is. I get that. But I just don't believe anymore. I read the Bible. There's an asterisk. This does not apply to you. All right? So this is what you think, right? It's oh, this doesn't apply to me. Or you're well, I don't really have any hopes for this life. My hope is in the next life. I can't really hope in people. I can't really hope for my business. I can't really hope for my job. I can't really hope for my marriage. Some of you, you've grown really cynical about your marriage, and you're only 10 years in. That's a life sentence, okay? If you're going to be cynical about your marriage, you got 40 or 50 years left. Maybe. You know what I realized in that moment in my 30s? As much as I didn't want to admit it, cynicism isn't inevitable. Cynicism is a choice. It's a choice. Now, you don't choose to get cynical. You just kind of slide into it. But if you're going to stay cynical, that's a choice, because life doesn't make you cynical. You make you cynical. I made me cynical. I decided to close my heart. I decided to stop trusting, stop hoping, stop believing. And so what do you do? Is that it? Well, the good news, and this is true for every week that we're covering, is there's an antidote. There's an antidote. And cynicism melts. If you want to get rid of your cynicism, what do you do? Cynicism melts under the relentless hope of the gospel. Now, what's the gospel, right? Some of you grew up in church, you walked away. It's like, I don't know what that is. I don't know what it means. Some of you are brand new to church. The gospel is simply, it means good news. And the good news is that there's hope. The good news is that we turned our back on God, but he didn't turn his back on us. The good news is that when God showed up in Jesus, and we didn't know what to do with him, so we nailed him to a cross, and every cynic in the world, every person in the world, would think that God was losing. If that's really your son, if that's who he is, you're losing. When Jesus was nailed to the cross, it's like, oh my goodness, there's God. We killed him. God is losing. God was using that very thing, the crucifixion, to bring about our forgiveness. When everybody thought God was losing, God was winning. When everybody only smelled death, God smelled resurrection. Because 2 days later, on the third day, 3 days later, Jesus would rise again from the dead. And all of a sudden, what do we bring God? We bring him death. We bring him the cynicism. We bring him a lack of hope. And he says, oh, no. I defeated death. Not only literally in the sense that we will live forever, but I broke down sin. And Carey, your past doesn't have to be your future. Not when you get Jesus involved. You may feel like death, but I'm bringing about resurrection. You may feel like it's over. I'm telling you it's just beginning. You may think you're done. I'm telling you we are just getting started. And when you get Jesus involved, when you get the gospel involved, cynicism melts under the relentless hope of the central message of Jesus Christ. And so as a result, this is what I've discovered in my own life. When you get Jesus involved, you can hope again, you can trust again, and you can believe again. That once a cynic, not always a cynic. That once defeated, not always defeated. That once a closed heart, not always a closed heart. And early Christians were trying to figure this out. Like, our world has got its problems, and we talk about that. And your life has its problems. But you want to know a hard life? Go back 2,000 years and live in first century Palestine. That is a hard life. Pestilence, disease, not sure if your family's going to make it, slavery, brutality, abuse. It's horrible. And Christians are trying to figure out, what does it mean to follow a man who was crucified and rose again? And how does God's love pour into our lives and out of our lives and into the lives of others? And so I want to read from a letter that Paul, who planted a lot of churches 2,000 years ago, wrote to a church in Ephesus filled with people trying to figure out what it means to live in a world of death and follow a God of resurrection. And he said, ever since I first heard of your strong faith in the Lord Jesus and your love for God's people everywhere. So there it is, faith and love. Faith and love, faith and love, faith and love. I have not stopped thanking God for you. Cynics don't thank anybody. Cynics are just despondent. And I pray for you constantly, asking God, the glorious Father, there's hope, of the Lord Jesus Christ, to give you spiritual wisdom and insight so that you might grow in your knowledge of God. Cynics don't grow, they stop growing because they know everything. I pray that your hearts will be flooded with light, not darkness, so that you can understand the confident hope that he has given to those he called his holy people, who are his rich and glorious inheritance. What is God's inheritance? You know what's so amazing? You are. And the work of his gospel in your life and the change that he brings about. He said, I also pray that you will understand the incredible greatness of God's power for us who believe him. Then he makes this unbelievable claim. You're like, Carey, you don't know my life story. There's a reason I'm cynical. And if we could sit down and have a long conversation, I would explain why it's so bad. You have no idea how much heartbreak. You have no idea how much dysfunction. You have no idea how hard it is. This is why I'm cynical. There's a good reason. And Paul says, remember this. This power that is at work in those of you who have trusted Jesus with your life, and if you haven't, I hope you do. I really believe he is the way, the truth, and the life for so many reasons. But if you've trusted your life to Jesus, then this same mighty power that raised Christ from the dead and seated him in the place of honor at God's right hand in the heavenly realms is at work in you. That the power that turned death into life, sin into forgiveness, is the power that's at work in you. So once a cynic, not always a cynic. And what I've experienced over the last decade and a bit is this rebirth, that you can hope again, you can believe again, you can trust again. So how do you do that? How do you do that? Because on the one hand, this sounds really, really big. It's like, okay, well, that's good, but like, embrace the gospel. And if you're not a Christian, I would encourage you to embrace Jesus. You know, prior to Jesus coming, the Hebrew Bibles were for the Hebrew people, and they read their scriptures, and Jesus was Jewish, but he said, this isn't just for the Jews, it's for the world. So regardless of your ethnic background, no matter where you were born, what you did, what you believe, the gospel's universal. And so embrace that. And I know no better antidote to cynicism than to daily live in the power of the gospel, the power of forgiveness, the power of hope. It turns cynics back into optimists. And your heart can live again and hope again and breathe again and believe again. But you're like, okay, that's up here at 30,000 feet. Yeah, it is, and it's deep in your heart if you believe it. But what's like a practical hack? So I want to give you a really practical tip. If you want to be less cynical by Friday, be curious. Just be curious. Because I don't know whether you've noticed this, but I've noticed this. The cynical are never curious, and the curious are never cynical. Curious people they're not cynical. And cynics are never curious. Why? Because remember, this is rooted in knowledge. Cynics don't need to ask questions. They already know. I know where this is going. I know where you're going to end up. I know how this ends. I know. And so they never ask any questions because they know everything. And they're no fun to be with. But the cynical, they're never curious. The curious, they're not very cynical. So be curious. When you think you know the answer, stop and ask a question. When you think you've got it all figured out, say, well, how can I honor this relationship by hoping again and believing again and trusting again? You almost, at one point Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven, to enter into it, it's like you've got to be like a little kid. So become like a 6-year-old. Why? What do we tell them? Shut up. That's what we tell our 6-year-olds when they're like that, right? No, go back to that. Like, why? Why not? Why wouldn't it work? Why wouldn't you hope again? And what I realized I had to do after that year where I stopped trusting people was I had to put my heart back in my hand again. And I said, okay, we will make some new friends. And I am going to hope again, and I am going to believe again. And those first few times, it feels so vulnerable because you're like, well, what if they disappoint me? What if they break my heart? What if this doesn't go well? And of course, what you realize after you've done it for a little while is actually most of the time it works out pretty well. Most people like you are just trying to connect, and they have good intentions. And most of this turns out really well. And if I'd kept my heart closed, I would have sacrificed the 90% that was good for the 10% that wasn't so good. And there are strategies to deal with toxic people and difficult people. We've talked about that before around here. But that doesn't mean everybody's difficult. That doesn't mean everybody's toxic. So this week, if you want to beat cynicism, put your heart in your hand. And maybe for some of you, this is your marriage. It's like, I got to hope again. I got to trust again. I got to believe again. Doesn't mean you're dumb. You've learned some things. But when hope dies, so much dies. And the gospel is a gospel of resurrection. So when you believe again, and you hope again, you trust again, cynicism doesn't stand a chance. And I found 12 or 13 years ago when I put my heart back in my hand, I said, okay, God, I'm going to trust again. I'm going to hope again. I'm going to believe again. I'm going to be curious. I want to be more curious and alive at 80 than I was at 40 or than I was at 30. You can be that. So this week, kick cynicism in the teeth. Stay curious. Trust again. hope again, and believe again. Let's pray. Father, it's a hard message. We live in a cynical world. And in an age where everybody knows everything at their fingertips, we know way too much. But you know, and you still believe, and you still hope, and you still trust, and you call us to do the same. So help us to hope again, believe again, trust again in our relationships, in our singleness, in our parenting, in our work, in our life, in our relationship with you. God, I just pray for every heart that's grown callous, everybody who just kind of died to hope, that you would bring about resurrection, that you would help us to be the most hopeful, optimistic, curious people on the planet. Because the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is the same power that's at work in us. In Jesus' name, amen.